Joining me next is Howard Bloom of MDRC to talk about the results of a small school study in New York City. Welcome, Mr. Bloom.
Thank you very much.
So perhaps you could start by defining small schools. You call them small schools of choice. What does that mean?
Right. These are schools, there are about 123 of them in total. We studied 105 of the 123. These are schools that were created since 2002.
Okay.
They have an entering class of ninth graders of somewhere on the order of 100 to 115 students. So the total capacity of the school, grades 9 to 12, is about 500, 550 kids total, somewhere in that ballpark.
Do we know how that compares to a typical New York City school?
Yes, that's a small fraction of the size of the average New York City school. It's less than half the size.
Wow.
It's less than half the size. And they're not just small, they're new. And of choice, the of choice part is they're unscreened. They're open to kids with all academic backgrounds. It's a very important aspect of these schools.
Okay. And what did your study find with respect to test scores and graduation rates at these schools?
Well, what our study found is that the question that our study addressed is how much difference do these schools make for the kids that go to them relative to the other kinds of schools that those kind of kids would have gone to. This is largely a very disadvantaged population of almost 92% black and Hispanic. So it's a very important group of kids. And it's a very large group of kids. We found that on average, this raised graduation rates 8.6%, almost 9% percentage points, so from about 60% to 69%, something in that ballpark. Which is, if you want to place that in context, if you ask yourself, is that large or small? That's about over 40% of the graduation gap between whites and non-whites in New York City. That's the magnitude of the impact of these schools.
And how do we know that the key variable here is the size of the school versus other factors?
What we don't know is the key variable is the size. What we do know, though, is it's these schools versus the other schools. Because of the way the study was set up, it's built on a set of randomized lotteries that actually happen as part of the way that New York City now assigns most of the kids to high schools and assigns all kids to these schools. When they're oversubscribed, the statistical equivalent of the lottery takes place. So we compared kids who got to go to these schools to kids who wanted to go to these schools but didn't get to go to these schools because they were oversubscribed, that are identical in all ways except these kids got to go to the school and the other kids didn't get to go to the school. So we know that we're comparing likes to like. And we know that going to these schools makes a fairly substantial difference in graduation rates. What we don't know is exactly what it is about these schools that made that difference. There are many things about these schools that are very important to take into consideration. They weren't just some small schools in other cities were constructed by shutting down a large school and simply reconfiguring the school with the same kids and the same teachers, in some cases the same principal. These are brand new schools. They were built from scratch. They were created by organizations that knew how to, that had experience starting schools. New teachers were brought in. So many things happened that were part of the creation of these schools that's beyond simply the fact that they were small. My personal opinion is that the smallness of these schools helped to facilitate the effect of these other changes, and a bunch of things sort of worked together.
Is this just a glorified argument for smaller class sizes? Because we get that a lot. You know, the problems with one of the big problems with schools in New York City, other large urban school districts, is just too many kids for one teacher to handle.
In part, that's true. The class sizes, I don't have the exact numbers on the tip of my tongue, are not markedly different than other class sizes, but the school size is different, and the organization of the school is different. They're set up in ways that groups of teachers, small groups of teachers, are responsible for small groups of students over periods of more than 1 year. So they get to know each other much better than would normally happen in a larger, more anonymous environment. That's certainly a part of it.
Okay, now you mentioned that this project got started in 2002. I know the Gates Foundation was heavily involved in giving New York City a bunch of money to start building these schools, but the Gates Foundation ultimately decided to move in a different direction with respect to pushing reform, to teacher quality, in fact. And I interviewed Bill Gates last year and asked him why he had not abandoned the small school market, because he defended it. He said the kids that go to these schools are definitely better off, but we decided that we're not getting that much bang for our buck in terms of outcomes. He said it's not moving the needle that much, and he wanted to move on to other types of reforms. I mean, what do you think explains that? I mean, because obviously we have only so much money to spend,
Right.
only so much time to try and get things done. Why go this route versus some other routes? I mean, for instance, charter schools or vouchers. If we're talking about graduation rates and test scores, is there evidence that smaller schools move the needle for low-income kids more than these other reforms?
Okay, so first of all, the Gates Foundation is funding this research, so there's continued interest in these schools. Second of all, when they made that decision, these kinds of findings were not available. There were other kinds of findings, but these kind of findings were not available. These are the most rigorous findings in terms of the actual impacts of these small schools that has ever been put together. So they did not have this information. Second of all, these schools were created differently than a lot of other small schools in a lot of other places, which is what they would have been able to look at the point in time when they were making their decisions in the past. The way it was done in New York, from everything we can tell, markedly different. A lot of the planning was different. A lot of the resources were different. A lot of the organizations that came to the table to create these schools were different. So not only were these findings not available when they made that decision, and as they look at these findings, I would hope that they are pleased with these findings. I cannot speak for them, but they were basing their decisions on other schools in other cities as well.
Okay.